All right, so today we're going to be diving into like the hidden world of web servers, like when you download like a huge file or you're, streaming something and it just works.
Yeah, it does seem like magic sometimes, doesn't it? But there's a lot going on behind the scenes to make that magic happen.
Exactly. And today we're kind of pulling back the curtain on a debate that's going on right now in the web dev world. And it all started with this thread that we saw on Hacker News about the content length header in HTTP responses.
Content length, the unsung hero of countless downloads.
Right. Like it's a thing that most people don't really think about. But some programmers are kind of throwing some shade, I guess you could say, at Go, which is the programming language. And they're surprised by how Go handles this header, especially when you're talking about streaming data where the file size isn't known beforehand.
Yeah, it's a classic case of explicit versus implicit communication.
Right.
And which one should be used in which case. You see, with content length, what the server usually does is tell your browser, okay, here's exactly how many bytes to expect up front.
Right.
That's what we call explicit communication. But when you're dealing with something that's dynamic, like a live stream or something, it's not really possible to know that full size in advance.
Right. I mean, it's like you're asking someone to tell you how long a movie is going to be before it's even been filmed yet. Like, how could you possibly know that?
Exactly.
So that's where things get kind of interesting. It sounds like this explicit approach, while simple, kind of falls apart when you don't know the total data size ahead of time.
Exactly. And that's where the implicit method or chunking comes in.
Yeah.
And that's just basically like, chopping up the data into bite-sized pieces, each of which has its own little size indicator on it. And this way the server can just keep feeding information without knowing how big the final file size is going to be.
So it's all about flexibility, right?
Exactly.
But why all the hate for Go? Did they mess up chunking? Is that what happened?
No, not quite. What's causing a stir is that Go kind of takes a proactive approach to this. So if you don't explicitly set the content length header, Go's like, don't worry, I got this. And it just starts chunking the data for you automatically.
So you're telling me that Go just automatically starts chunking data if you don't set content length?
That seems like it could lead to some unexpected consequences.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah. And that's precisely the debate that's raging right now on Hacker News. Some developers are praising Go for being helpful and streamlining the process. Others are crying foul, saying that it takes away control and can lead to confusion, especially for programmers who are coming from languages where they're used to having more of a tighter grip on things. One commenter, Hobofan, even mentioned that they have to handle chunking manually in other languages. Can you imagine the headache?
Oh yeah, I can only imagine. I mean that sounds like a lot of work. So it sounds like Go is trying to be helpful, right?
Yeah.
By automatically chunking data, but it's kind of being met with mixed feelings. Some people love it, some people hate it. I guess it's kind of a tale as old as time in the tech world, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But why are some developers so adamant about having that explicit content length, even if it means doing the chunking themselves?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it gets to the heart of why this seemingly like obscure header is causing such a stir to begin with. It's all about control, predictability.
Yeah.
Avoiding unintended consequences, which as we'll see can get pretty significant when you start talking about things like security and data integrity. But we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit.
Ooh, a little bit of a cliffhanger. Okay, so we're talking about the nitty gritty of how data gets sent across the web, but suddenly we're hinting at security risks and data integrity. I love a good deep dive because you never know where it's going to go.
Yeah, no, you're right on the money with security and data integrity. Those potential downsides to these implicit approaches that we were talking about. Well, there's this comment in the thread from Kulak, and they really bring those downsides into focus. They talk about this really nasty bug that they ran into that was related to file compression.
File compression, you mean like zipping a file?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. How does that relate to content length?
Well, when you zip a file, what you're doing is you're basically squeezing it down. Right. You're making it smaller so that it takes up less space. It transmits faster. But here's the thing. If the server doesn't adjust that content length header to reflect the compressed size, then you're kind of setting yourself up for trouble.
Wait, so the browser is expecting a certain number of bytes based on that original file size. but then it gets this compressed package that's smaller. So what happens then?
Yeah, it can be a real mess. Or as Kulak put it in the thread, silent failures. The download might look like it finished, but then when you try to open up the file or unzip it or whatever, it's corrupted.
Oh, wow.
And it's all because of that mismatch between what the content length header promised and what actually showed up.
Wow. I bet those silent failures are really hard to debug too. But, you mentioned security risks earlier, and I'm kind of curious about this. I mean, content length, this seems like a pretty basic header, right? But can it really be used by hackers to do bad things?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, there were a few comments in the thread that touched on this. Something called HTTP request smuggling vulnerabilities. Which I know sounds incredibly technical, but basically by manipulating the content length header, attackers can potentially inject malicious code right into a request.
Well, hold on. Are you saying that just by messing with this one header, hackers could potentially take over websites or steal people's data? That's kind of scary.
Yeah, it's not a good situation, and it just highlights how even these tiny little cracks in a system can be exploited if you're not careful.
Yeah, and it also comes back to that original question of how much control developers should have over this seemingly simple header, right? It makes you realize that every choice that you make, every line of code, it can have these ripple effects, right? That you might not even be aware of. But I'm still a little bit stuck on this idea of optimizing content size for faster downloads. There was a comment about how Google's front page was famously small back in the day. Do they still do that? Or are those kinds of optimizations kind of a relic of the dial-up era?
It's a great question. And honestly, it's a fascinating little bit of web history. Back then, shaving off every single kilobyte of data, it was absolutely crucial, right? Because internet speeds were just a fraction of what they are today. Do you remember dial-up modems?
Oh, yeah, I remember those days.
That sounded progress, right?
It took 5 minutes for a web page to load.
It really is amazing how much the internet has changed.
It's incredible.
But that obsession with optimization back then, it wasn't just, some kind of techie quirk.
Yeah.
It was all about the user experience.
Right.
Every second that they could shave off of that loading time.
Yeah.
Meant, happier users. And let's be honest, it meant more money for businesses too. In fact, the comment even mentioned this book called High Performance Websites, which I would highly recommend if you're really curious about that era of web development. It's really amazing to see how much effort went into, making websites fast.
I can imagine. I mean, it's like the difference between hand delivering a message and sending it by carrier pigeon, right?
Yeah.
Every millisecond counts.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of speed, somebody mentioned that newer versions of HTTP, like HTTP 2 and HTTP 3, they handle streaming totally differently. So does that mean that content length is on the way out?
You're one step ahead of me again.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. HTTP 2 and HTTP 3, they're like the sleek modern sports cars of the internet protocol world. And they've got, all these fancy mechanisms for handling streams of data very, very efficiently, which really makes chunking and by extension, this whole content link debate a lot less relevant in those contexts.
So what you're saying is that what seems like a fundamental concept today,
right,
could be totally obsolete tomorrow.
Exactly. And that brings us to
the big takeaway here is that the web is always changing, right? It never sits still.
That's it. And this whole content length thing, I mean, it started with just one little question on Hacker News, but it really shows how the web is always evolving.
So where does that leave, the average person who just wants to, watch their shows online or download a file? They probably don't want to have to think about all this technical stuff.
That's true. But I think it shows how important it is to stay curious. The web might seem like magic sometimes, but there are people behind it, working on it, making it all work.
Yeah.
And it's good to kind of understand a little bit about how it all works.
All right. Yeah, I agree. And you know what? You've inspired me. I'm going to add that High Performance Websites book to my reading list. It sounds like a fascinating look at how the web used to be.
Definitely worth a read.
And hey, maybe in a few years we'll have to do another deep dive. Who knows what new technologies will be around by then?
I'm always up for a good deep dive.
That's what I like to hear. All right. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for listening, everybody. And remember, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep learning.